You're watching the International Schiller Institute Conference. Let us join hands with the global majority to create a new chapter in world history. Our final speaker for this morning's panel, which will be followed by questions and discussion, is Diane Sayre of the United States, a LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate from New York. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Diane, in a sense, actually started today's proceedings in that she was the conductor for the Schiller Institute in the performance of the African-American spiritual, I Don't Feel No Ways Tired. There's a serious question as to the intellectual and moral requirements demanded of successful candidates or would-be successful candidates for the high office in the United States. How are these candidates going to be able to recruit people from the BRICS Plus nations to help overcome the decades of failure in domestic and foreign policy on the part of the transatlantic world if they can't be trusted? And I think what's important about whatever she was going to tell us is to keep in mind that the issue that is before us, and we'll get into this in questions and answers, is where do we go from here? We have a moment, we have an opportunity, but you also have to have the leadership that's able to take that advantage of that opportunity. So welcome, Diane, and you have the floor.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Dennis, and thank you, Helga, for convening this conference. When I was recently at the New York State Fair in Syracuse, I learned that the building of the Erie Canal led to a 40-fold increase in the population of Syracuse. Think about that. 40 times more people moved into that city of Syracuse in 10 years. And that 40-fold increase of population became more and more prosperous with the diverse market that the canal opened up, allowing transport of goods back and forth between New York City and Buffalo. Now, contrast what happened in Syracuse to the statement of the New York City Mayor, Eric Adams, who said a couple days ago, of the 110,000 migrants who've arrived in New York City since April of last year, quote, "Never in my life have I had a problem that I didn't see an ending to, and I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York City," unquote. I hate to tell you, Mayor Adams, but New York City was already destroyed. It was destroyed in 1975 with the Municipal Assistance Corporation, just as Lyndon LaRouche warned. That's why a city of over 8 million people can't absorb 100,000 more. The city can't even take care of its own population. In 2018, there were 100,000 homeless children in the New York City public schools, and a New York City educator just told me that even before the influx of migrants, 19,000 of whom will be entering the public schools and mostly don't speak English, many New York City classrooms already had as many as 40 students per teacher. Do you want to produce a nation of morons, derelicts, and drug addicts? It's a good way to do it. But why do we need schools? Our nation isn't doing anything. Let me remind you that in 1907, the United States absorbed triple the number of immigrants per capita as we have now entering our nation, even if you combine both legal and illegal migrants. But what was our nation doing? How did we liberate ourselves mostly from the British Empire? Lyndon LaRouche, the greatest American of all time, pointed to the work of the young bastard from the Caribbean, Alexander Hamilton. Having witnessed the horrors of slavery on the sugar plantations of Nevis, where slaves only lived for a few months after being brought over, he was an adamant opponent of slavery. After the revolution against the British Empire was won, Hamilton became our first Treasury Secretary, and he wrote 4 papers which LaRouche often cited and which should be the guide for any American patriot. The paper on the subject of manufactures, on public credit, on the national bank, and then when the bank was under attack, on the constitutionality of the national bank. I suspect that there is not even one high school in this nation that teaches those papers, which were so crucial to the founding of the United States. What Hamilton founded was the means by which human creativity could be deployed to raise the platform of human economy. Certain things were critical, obviously, transportation and energy. Imagine Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and the Marquis de Lafayette in the middle of the Revolution, standing in Paterson, New Jersey, looking at the Great Falls, planning that these would be harnessed to generate power for a modern industrial city, Paterson, New Jersey, which of course now lies in a shambles, full of crime, homicides, and actually was the home to 11 of the 9/11 hijackers. But what else did we do? We built the Transcontinental Railroad with amazing Chinese workers, in spite of racism against them. They were wise enough to drink tea instead of just water out of wherever, boiling the water, and therefore were very healthy and were a crucial part of that construction. And the railroad was built in the middle of the British orchestrated, misnamed Civil War, and the completion of it, and then the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, even after President Lincoln was assassinated by pro-British agents, inspired the world. American Civil War veterans went to Egypt to create an army and build the Suez Canal. Verdi wrote an opera celebrating the completion of this canal. Was the purpose of this just so we could loot Egypt? Was the Panama Canal built so we could loot Panama? The point is that Americans knew that we were still in a war against the British colonial system, and that eradicating poverty around the world, allowing more republics to flourish, not by invading and overthrowing their governments, but by allowing them to develop what LaRouche would call a full set economy, was the key. This would make it more difficult for the British Empire to run its destabilizing drug and slave running agenda. People say the British were the first to eradicate slavery. What about the British East India Company? So we suffered more assassinations. Garfield and McKinley, both staunch advocates for the development of the Transcontinental Railroad through to Ibero-America. Their plans would never have allowed the nations south of our border to become the drug producers for the British Empire, which was still thriving in certain pockets of the United States, emphatically on Wall Street and with the Boston Brahmins, among others. Then with FDR, we had a return to Alexander Hamilton's principles. And that was no accident, as one of Franklin Roosevelt's forebears, Isaac Roosevelt, had been a collaborator of Hamilton generations earlier. Unable to tackle the unconstitutional Federal Reserve, FDR used the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to issue billions of dollars of credit to construct thousands of new schools, roads, bridges, power plants, post offices, sewage treatment plants, hospitals, and other great projects. Most notably, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which transformed one of the poorest, illiterate, malaria-infested, backward parts of the nation into one of the most productive parts of the United States. Again, as after the Civil War, after World War II, delegations from all over the world came to tour the 16-plus new dams built by the TVA, which allowed cheap, abundant electricity, coupled with breakthroughs in fertilizer, flood control, etc., which increased food production in the region and other kinds of production by orders of magnitude. One delegation came from China. The success of the TVA inspired and consolidated their plans to build the Three Gorges Dam. Even Afghanistan built a Helmand Water Authority modeled on the Tennessee Valley Authority. But the British had made sure to prolong World War II so that FDR would not be around to oversee the end of the war and the end of colonialism, which is what he intended. Franklin Roosevelt would never have dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. The FBI and the McCarthyite witch hunts took over the political scene, with Eisenhower a welcome reprieve, and then John F. Kennedy, whom Eleanor Roosevelt came to support and offer advice, became president. Again, President John F. Kennedy revived Hamiltonian principles. We began building again. He also wanted to eradicate poverty worldwide and was a friend of Patrice Lumumba, who was assassinated in 1961, just after Kennedy was elected. Then Kennedy was assassinated. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy were all killed within 5 years of each other. The Vietnam War, which Kennedy had intended to end, was launched full force. The post-industrial flower child, green, anti-human cultural project of the British Tavistock Institute and the CIA became our culture, and we became insane. Just at that time, Lyndon LaRouche began recruiting a hard core of moral intellectual elites at American universities and later internationally. He decided in 1976 that he had to run for president of the United States. And by 1983, he was Ronald Reagan's back channel to the Soviet Union on the matter of strategic defense. The Soviets rejected LaRouche and Reagan's proposal to jointly develop laser weapons against nuclear missiles, and the Soviet Union therefore collapsed economically, just as LaRouche warned they would. By the late 1980s, the treasonous intelligence agencies and their mainstream propaganda outlets in the New York Times and elsewhere, all funded by Wall Street crooks, had geared up a Get LaRouche task force, not only shutting down LaRouche's Fusion Energy Foundation, his anti-drug War on Drugs magazine, his newspaper, but ultimately jailing him and over a dozen of his associates in what former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark called the longest-running, broadest-range operation to lay low a political leader in his time or to his knowledge. Perhaps this is why, as the leaders of Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa, India, and so many other nations are finally throwing off the yoke of the British colonial divide and conquer games, Americans have lost their way and are not rejoicing. If we were sane, we would recognize this long overdue fulfillment of the principles of the American Revolution. Instead, we are so bowed down by the rage and frustration of our self-inflicted oppression that we are missing it. But happily, we are a nation of immigrants, and the liars and traitors in the mainstream media and who infest our government agencies will not be able to suppress the news forever. The truth of the rejection of colonialism is seeping in, and I am optimistic that the enemy won't be able to contain it. My biggest fear, other than that we launch a nuclear war to stop it, is that as this stinky old monolith collapses, Americans will be looking at their dirty socks and not at the stars, which is where we have to go, along with our brothers and sisters of the entire human race worldwide. Thank you.